Hi everybody, I'm Fran Spielman, and with me are two of my treasured colleagues, Tim Novak, the investigative specialist extraordinaire, and John Seidel, who does the same thing at the federal building for the Chicago Sun-Times. And did you guys ever think that you would see a headline like this? I mean, we've all been around forever. Tim, what do you think?
No, it's been a long time coming. If Alderman Burke had not stayed so long, he would have skated free. But I think he overstayed himself.
What do you think, John?
And it's really remarkable and the kind of case we haven't seen in a while. I mean, this is a really big deal and a really big case that they've been working on, I think, longer than we realized. So, no, this is really, really something.
Well, and let's talk a little bit about the news that within a day, less than a day, Mayor Emanuel has forced the resignation of Ed Burke as finance chairman. The way I see it, there was no other way to go. You could not leave him in there presiding over the most important legislation and fighting federal corruption charges. Also, if he didn't step down, he was going to be removed by his colleagues. What do you think? Were you surprised?
No, it was an orchestrated effort to get him out of the committee. He's lost a lot of his trappings. He's lost his detail now. He's lost his power base.
His chauffeur.
His drivers. He's lost the office that he has used all these years to help enrich himself, both politically, through his power, through his campaign fund, and then through his own personal wealth.
Were you surprised?
Maybe just a little. I mean, we've seen cases like this before where the aldermen are defiant, or politicians who are charged are defiant and stick to their guns. But this really, I guess, wasn't his choice either. And at the end of the day, you're right. I mean, it would really be a big cloud hanging over his head while he handled all of his business. So you're probably right. There was no choice.
What stunned me about the indictment as I read it was the two-bit nature of the shakedown, the alleged shakedown. Here is a man who's sitting on a $12 million campaign war chest, who's been in office for 50 years, who is wealthier than hell, who has a fortress of a home in Gage Park, on. And here he is allegedly extorting legal business from someone as if he were a two-bit hustler. I mean, talk about the charges outlined for us. Who wants to go first here?
Well, I mean, I think you're right, and what do they say? You always pretend act like everybody's always wearing a wire, right? And so it is pretty surprising in that regard. I mean, as you read through the complaint, though, I do think I think he's careful in his wording. I mean, some of the bigger quotes, the playing hardball quote, comes from somebody else, right?
Jim Andrews.
Peter Andrews, yeah. So in that regard, it could see him a little caution there. But you're right. You'd think, after all this time, you wouldn't expect a case like this.
Tim, what do you think? I mean, outline the charges for us. Tell our viewers what exactly Burke is accused of doing here.
You have a fast food restaurant, a Burger King franchisee, one of the largest franchise holders in the country, wanted to remodel this restaurant, which they had recently purchased. They needed to obtain some permits from the city to do the work, including driveway permits, which were already in place, but you need to renew these when ownership transfers. So they went to the alderman for help, and the alderman did what we all think he's done all these years. He discussed the project with the owners, and then he informed them of the other things he could do for them. Very subtly, that he has a law business that specializes in property tax assessments. They told him they already had somebody that does that. Their reluctance, their reticence to pick up on his cue, if you will, delayed their project for well over a year as they kept delaying permits, stopping the construction, basically putting a brick on it until they seemed to realize that unless they gave him some legal business, this wasn't going to go anywhere.
Now, John, do you see any place where Burke can say, well, I didn't get the legal business, or I didn't really threaten them, or there was no quid pro quo? Where is his legal defense going to come from?
I mean, I think you just kind of touched on it. I mean, he didn't get the business in the end. I mean, as Tim said, they did kind of realize near the end that we're just going to have to give in and do this. But there was somebody associated with the company who did tax work for them that really didn't want to give in and drag his feet and strung this whole thing out, and Burke never got the business, right? And
But you don't have to in order to commit
you don't
a
have
crime.
to. You don't have to, and it's attempted extortion, right?
Right.
So, right. But he could argue, I didn't get the business. They got their permit. And as I was mentioning before, I mean, you're looking for that smoking gun within the complaint, and I think there's some room where he could say, I never really said that, or that's not what I meant. They took it that way, but that's not what I meant. Now, whether a jury would see it that way, would remain to be seen. But I think that's where the defense is.
One thing that I think is important here is I don't think a lot of people understand the law firm of Clafter and Burke, which there is no Clafter. He died decades ago. So Clafter and Burke is really Ed Burke, and it's Ed Burke and 3 other lawyers, one of whom is his daughter. So this is all they do. They do nothing else but appeal property tax assessments. This is a relatively small client that Burke has. I mean, many of his clients are larger. He's at AT&T. Trump Tower is the one that's got him in a lot of trouble.
But he wanted all of their Illinois business, all the Burger King franchises.
Yes,
right?
he did.
It wasn't small potatoes, really.
Well, but the firm is you will see in the in the criminal complaint that the Burger King owners are questioning the ability of Burke's firm to even do this kind of work, that they're kind of like ham-handed, and how can these people actually even do this? But yet here's a man who is appealing the taxes for years on Trump Tower. And so, there's always been a question of, how does Donald Trump come to town to build his skyscraper and end up with Ed Burke as his property tax lawyer, instead of one of the myriad other firms that are politically connected that could do this work, whether it's Mike Madigan or whoever. But somehow they end up with Ed Burke.
And it did well for them, too.
It did.
Saved them what?
Well, we calculated that Burke has saved Trump $14 million in taxes. He has tried to purge himself now of his relationship with Trump.
Too late. Way too late.
Way too late.
Tone deaf. Unbelievably so in a majority Hispanic ward. How did he not know that was a finger in the eye to his constituents? What does that say about him?
I think there's a great degree of arrogance here. That he had done this for so long, and he had dispatched opponents before. He's really never had a serious race like this before. I think many years he never even had an opponent at all. So he never really had to worry about his status. He was able to lock down his chairmanship of the Finance Committee. No one dared take it from him, whether it's a mayor or his colleagues.
They were all afraid of him.
They were all afraid of him. And I think
because he knows too much. He has a file on everybody. I mean, he's like the J. Edgar Hoover of City Hall.
He has a 50-year history, and he knows it well.
And so he was more dangerous sniping from the outside than he was bringing him into the tent. And so every mayor, Daley didn't like him, had a lifelong rivalry with him. Rahm Emanuel blamed him for being the heavy hand behind the residency challenge in 2011, yet he reached an accommodation with him. Everybody tolerated it and allowed this. Let's talk a little bit about Toni Preckwinkle. She is a beneficiary of the campaign contribution that Burke allegedly muscled from the Burger King owner. Talk about that, John.
Yeah, and she's not named in the complaint, but it's pretty much
admits,
acknowledged that it's her. And Burke was leaning on these Burger King executives to attend a political fundraiser. And again, as they realized that they kind of had to play ball with Burke, they realized they had to at least make a donation. So I believe it was they made a $10,000 donation, but because it was over the limits, they wound up being reduced to $5,600. I guess we said I don't think there's anything in the complaint that alleges that Preckwinkle was doing anything wrong. But obviously there are questions, right, about why Burke was pushing for them to attend that fundraiser.
And Tim, there are problems for Preckwinkle because of her filing or lack thereof. Let's talk about that.
My understanding is Preckwinkle and her campaign were unaware of all this coming until yesterday when the charges were announced. They never recorded the donation. They're claiming now that they never accepted the donation, that they returned it. But legally, you still have to record that donation as something you received, and then you have to record that you returned it. That was never done. Now they've done that. They've recorded it, that they received it, and they recorded that they returned it all, except that my understanding is they have not returned it all. They kept 5,600 of it, which is the legal limit of what you can accept, and they returned $4,400 of it to the Burger King owners. They're maintaining they returned all of it. There is apparently documentation that the Burger King owners only received 4,400 of it back.
So is this something that could sink her mayoral campaign? Does it say something about what kind of mayor she would be? What do you think? Anybody? John?
I mean, I'd certainly defer to you. I certainly think it's a problem for her, but there are other candidates that have ties to Burke too, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's so many variables in this race. I mean, but again,
the way I see it, the person with maybe the dirtiest hands at the moment would be, say, Chico, because he worked for Burke, he had Burke's endorsement, he worked for Burke during council wars, and he has this long-standing friendship. And not that he is culpable in anything his Burke's doing, but he is tied to him closest. Then you have Preckwinkle with her problem with the contribution and the fundraiser that she had. You have Mendoza, who wouldn't have been state rep without him. The first race that she lost, the second race that she won, and city clerk that she won, and then now as state controller, and got married at his house. Boy, that house was busy, wasn't it?
That house is...
what is it, a rooftop that he has these fundraisers and these weddings, and must be something.
That house is...
Have you ever been there?
I've not been inside.
You haven't been invited? I can't believe it.
No, I've not been invited, but I've been all around it. It's a very, very large house. It's probably 3 to 4 times larger than any other house in the neighborhood, and it dwarfs every house both in size and in height, and is surrounded by a gate, and the orange line runs right behind it. And there have been many fundraisers and parties and weddings, all political events in that house over the years.
In looking at the indictment, John, when I saw the number of phone calls of his cell phone that were taped, it occurred to me that this Burger King thing they may have just stumbled upon in the course of a much broader and larger and longer investigation, and that there's a lot of other stuff that's going to come down. How much more are we going to see from this?
Well, it's hard to say, but there's clearly room for more to come out, and I think that's an excellent point. You know, I think one of the earliest calls we see there is around call 300 something, right?
Right.
But if you look through the complaint, as time goes on, those calls, the number of calls increases rapidly. A couple days later, they're into 400. It goes on. I think I'm not sure exactly where it ended, but I think by October or so, it was into 7,000.
Whoa.
Calls that they're listening to, right?
I think I was on there being hung up on a bunch of times. I'm sure you were too, right?
Well,
that's the cell phone we call.
And we don't know in here, I don't believe it says exactly when the judge gave the go-ahead to start listening to those calls, or why.
Yeah, why? It wasn't the Burger King,
and there was
right?
apparently surveillance too. They were watching him driving around. They mentioned that they
Beverly Country Club and so on.
Right. So, yeah, and you know, the way they charged this, I mean, kind of gives a sense that they wanted to get these charges filed, but you know, he's going to have to be indicted, and then we could see a superseding, possibly, you know, just depending on how this plays out. So, yeah, there's lots of room for more to come out.
Basically, his phone was tapped for 16, 17, 18 months. They were recording his conversations. There are going to be a lot of people in town. There are a lot of people in town
wondering what they might have
wonder
said.
what they were recorded saying to him on that phone.
Oh, there's no doubt. There's a lot of tight throats all over town, I'm sure.
And I just wanted to add, I mean, we didn't find out about this till the raid in November, right? this goes back in the complaint to May of 2017. So all that time between last November and May 2017.
And why did they suddenly get on to him? What is it? I mean, Tim, let's face it, we have written so many dozens and dozens of stories where Burke has been investigated and skated and investigated and skated. One of the most dangerous ones for him, I remember, being Alderman Joe Martinez, who was a ghost payroller on the Finance Committee and was working at Burke's law firm, and he testified to that, and nothing happened. Or you had the daughter of Tony Lorino on the Finance Committee payroll. There was Burke's role in the Pat Hewell security firm. On and on, we've seen so many things. Why has he skated for this long, and why now, as he turns 75?
I don't know why he's skated so long. There's always been the rumor out there, as you're well aware of. I'm told Mayor Daley was a firm believer in the rumor that Ed Burke was an informant for the FBI, so that gave him carte blanche to do whatever he did. I don't know whether that's true or not. I don't know if we ever will know if that's true or not. Why now? I think part of life is to know when to leave the party. And
He didn't.
Mr. Burke did not know when to leave the party.
And the irony, John, as we go, that Ed Verdoliak and Ed Burke, both of them, Verdoliak facing a return to prison, Burke facing prison. The two cohorts in council wars. Amazing.
Right. Yeah, no, Verdoliak's been under indictment for some time now, and it's got a trial coming up pretty soon, and I think we may be hearing more about that very soon. Interestingly, the same prosecutor on both cases, too.
And we'll leave you with this line from Batman. This town needs an enema. See you next week.